So it would be important for Rousseau to mention this idea of things and to mention this idea of man in connection to education, particularly school, or rather specifically school, because it was, and again, we're thinking about his own lived experience with school, right? Which wasn't necessarily a positive one because he didn't feel as if it sort of fed his natural desires as an intellectual being, right? We're thinking about him being this avid reader who was very self-educated, who was sort of very critical at a very young age, um, both of school and of his what he was reading, but then also too of his own family life, because of how the ways in which even his mother's side of the family sort of kind of viewed the father's side of the family. And all of this sort of comes out in his book Confessions, which is a really interesting read. I mean, it has to be interesting read, right? It's the book is called Confessions. That's a sidebar. But the importance for us in thinking about this idea of man and things, and seeing how these modes of education can be in conflict with each other, as well as in conflict with the mode of education of nature, is to sort of think about the purpose of education. And for Rousseau, it was his belief that these things, while they were these things again being sort of social institutions, were manufactured for society. He's not okay with society. He is very critical about the political corruption of society that, in his mind, was engineered and maintained by many of these social institutions, which were sort of class stratified, but didn't necessarily have the kind of utopian ideals that were being embodied and embraced during the Enlightenment. And so we didn't get too into detail with Emile, this imaginary pupil that he has. But for Rousseau, a good education would be one that was highly individualized, that really sought to have the individual better understand themselves and use their sort of natural desires to learn about the world. And this is why he mentions this idea of swaddling, which again gets complicated because of how he doesn't sort of frame it as an example that he's trying to use as a metaphor to sort of think about how the natural man is so confined by these other bureaucratic ideas about education and what particular people should be learning at a particular time and how they should be learning at a particular time. This idea of swaddling for Rousseau in many ways was sort of correlated with these chains that he felt was placed on the natural man given his socialization to become a citizen, to become a civilized man. And for him, the civilized man, and he would have some contradictory beliefs about this as well, because on the one hand, while he didn't want individuals to sort of be isolated from community, and he wanted sort of individuals to sort of better understand themselves in relation to community, he was also very critical of the citizen, because in his mind, the citizen was one who had sort of become the institution uncritically. And it was in becoming the institution uncritically, and we're thinking not just school, not just governments, We're thinking religion as well. We're thinking industry as well. Different labor markets that were sort of opening up. Not so much slavery, although certainly we can sort of take that idea there. Um, and thinking about sort of becoming uh, these robots of the state, without sort of better understanding. Okay, but what's the other purpose here? What are these sort of other ideas, natural desires that we had before we became a part, of those things? And that's not to say that he wanted to sort of disband those institutions, although certainly he didn't want to sort of disband school. In many ways, his thinking about education was very similar to indigenous peoples, in that it was his belief that it should sort of be every day, that the classroom should not be this one building, that your teacher should not be teaching groups of 30, but rather you should have a tutor, and a tutor should be teaching sort of one pupil. That education should sort of not just be solely linked to one's job, what one sort of did for the state, but education should sort of be about learning about the self and one's place in the world. And so that conversation becomes really important for us, again, in thinking about the purpose of school, and in thinking about education, and thinking about today's society, today's mode of education of things, and the myriad amount of social institutions that become those things, that organize our environment. Because people spend a lot of time talking about family, which is very, very true. But family is not the only thing that raises us from the time that we're born. We have to think about healthcare system, the kinds of hospitals or clinics that we're born into. We have to think about media. We have to sort of think about the effect of globalization on the kinds of social institutions that we partake in every single day. Gas, the kind of gas that we take, the social institutions that are designed for the physical, ecological environment, religious institutions certainly, the criminal justice system as a social institution. All of these sorts of institutions that organize our world and organize our environment as we know it, as being influential to our development as a human being because of how they serve as a mode of education. At the very same time that family serves as a mode of education. And so I sort of just want to offer that in thinking about the three modes of education and in thinking about the natural man, and sort of moving forward with our readings and moving forward answering this question of what's the purpose of school? What has it been? What do we want it to be? And what are we learning? What is education? What does sort of education look like? Because again, education, to understand that every living moment is a learning moment. So it's happening outside of school. How do these social institutions, which organize our environment, how do these things overlap? How do they contradict each other? How do they sort of become consistent? How does man shape these institutions or not? And what are the ways in which our sort of natural developments respond differently, right? How do we sort of respond differently both to man and to things, so that we can better investigate how the individual learns in American society.